Okay, so we're just going to look at a little closer look here at some of the changes we made. More detailed look at more significant changes was we consolidated some of the system questions, and we'll just give you an example of that in a minute. Shift to more measurable and realistic standards so that one shoe doesn't fit all, right? And all square pegs don't fit in all round holes, so we have to look at some things individually because we have such diversity within our companies. Size, the type of work, administrative type companies, all the way out to pure field companies. Adjustment to element B, formal hazard assessment. And this is fairly significant because this is an area that in this business we have identified. We have it all the way from some of the largest companies in the world, the systems that they have in place, all the way down to, JR's hazard assessment system, and it could be very, very simplistic. So we want to really cut to the quick on those and just say this is what the auditor needs to measure. Whether it's on 5 pages, 10 pages, 1 page, it doesn't matter. We just need to know. And the auditors have to have a little more latitude on where to gather that information, and we've written that into the guidelines, and we think that will be helpful for the auditors. Expanded question and scoring guidance. We've spent a lot of time writing pretty extensive guidelines, and the reason we did that was we have over 375 internal auditors, and we're gaining 20 a month. So we have almost all our classes now are populated with internal auditors, and they're filling up faster than we can actually put them on the scale in the last 6 months. So we want to support those people that audit 5 to 15 days out of 1,000 days, literally, unless you're doing a big company. The reality is you could not possibly audit once a year where you're going to be auditing 3 to 5 days and then remember all the steps and be able to go through this process flawlessly. So we want to be able to take you through the course that we've provided, and that's why we've decided to make changes in our auditor course because we're not getting the results we want from our student auditors. And we need to have auditors not that necessarily can make 95 on the test at the end of the week. We need auditors that know how to audit when they leave. We need to have them empowered when they leave to be able to go through, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, I have some difficulty. Can I contact someone for support? And that's where we have to really step up our game, that when you're out there as internal auditors, that we're giving you support when you need it, so that you don't feel like you're left to the wolves. We have a huge variance between external auditors and internal auditors as far as health and safety education goes. In some cases, they're equal across the board. In other cases, you may be brand new to health and safety and you've completed a 2-day auditor or 2-day safety program development course, and now you're going to take a 5-day auditing course. That is a huge leap from going to take basic health and safety to now you're measuring a system. And that takes years to understand. So we want to make sure that we're giving the support where the support is most needed. I think the external auditors, for the most part, the expanded questions and guidelines, or the change questions and guidelines, it will just make it easier for them to interpret. They'll probably look at the guideline and scan it once or twice as they're going through, and then they will spend less time looking at it as they do more audits. That's our thoughts. But we figured there's more in this case is better. And when we sent our guideline information out to our cross-industry committee, some of the feedback that came back even from external auditors was, you need to provide a math example in this area, or you need to provide another example in this area. So even when we knew we were kind of light on the guideline, it actually proved out that even experienced auditors were saying, you probably should have this. Even though they may have been okay with the question, they're looking at it from the perspective that they were reviewing for many others at the same time. Okay, and then integrated interview guidance. So that's quite different there. So typical structure in 2012 protocol was: does the system have X? Does the system have Y? If you're not familiar with the audit protocol, the 0, 2 means it's an all or nothing question. And if you're using our e-compliance tool, that means you have to make that scoring adjustment. You have to put in your positive indicators. And in the case of something like this, it's all or nothing. There would be criteria built in there to score that question, and it's either there or it isn't, and you would put either 0 or 100% whether it's there or it's not. So this is kind of what we would look at, and in this case, does the system have Z or Z, 0, 2, all or nothing, and then an interview question in there, and have to meet a certain standard in order to award points. Generally in our audit protocol was if it was 80% positive indicators or more, then points would be awarded. And of course, you weren't actually awarding the points. You're simply entering the percent positive indicators, and the e-tool and the smart guy that lives inside there was doing the math for you, right? So we wanted to restructure some of these questions to say, does the system have X, Y, Z? And the reason why we've done that is because it's more efficient. You have a document in front of you. You're able to look at that document. Does it have this criteria? Yes, it does. Write a single note and score to that. Okay. Now you will see here we have 3 criteria, and we have a multiple of 9 points. So Andy was strategic in doing that all throughout. We just looked for those multiples wherever it would be a natural alignment. So that would either be 3, 6, 9, or 12. It would be a multiple of 3. Does that really matter to most of us that's auditing? Actually not, because we're putting in our percent positive indicators. But for people understanding the scoring, and we wanted to keep that consistent scoring through topic, through element, we wanted to make sure that we were keeping that balance throughout. And that was something that we strategically did. So here's the question as it's structured in 2013 protocol. It looks something like this here. Does the system have X, Y, and Z? Auditor would enter the score only once instead of 3 individual scores. So that's time, right? Time, energy to do that. So if all 3 criteria were present, you would award, of course, 100% positive indicators. If only 2, it would round up to 67. If there was only 1 criteria met, you would pop 33 in, right? And it will score, and you would write that in. Yeah. Now, the auditor would only write a single note instead of 3. If 100%, a note declares all present and offers some company-specific reference on at least 1 item would suffice. On at least 1 item. We're not asking you to write a Harlequin romance for any of you that are of my genre. We're not asking you just to write for the sake of writing. We're asking you simply give us at least 1 example of what was reviewed, what was sampled, what was observed. Okay? If you are not finding that in your notes, as you're going through your documentation review, you are not collecting appropriate information. You must do it as you're going through in order to have defensible notes. Okay? If less than 100% is missing criteria would be identified in the notes, this fulfills the company-specific in justifying the score. So as Joe said, you might give an example of what was positive and what's there, and then you might give an example of what was missing, because that's also going to trigger in your mind where you need to write a recommendation, where there's something not there to award full points. Okay, so you should be keeping, when I'm using the field note area of the e-compliance tool, I'm writing my field notes down, and when I find a deficiency, the first thing I do is I write that, and then for myself in large letter, I put REC, and that means recommendation. And then when I copy those notes in, or I take those notes into my finished notes, I know then that I must put a recommendation in there, right? So that I'm always tracking where there is a deficiency found. So this is what you're currently seeing, and currently you had to write a note for each one of these, right? And in some cases, our communication was not, if there was part questions or a subset questions, you could have written an overall note, but some people just stayed to writing an individual note because they found that to be effective, and they got through QA and they didn't have any more issues. So what we're doing now, and this may look a little convoluted to you, but it's a bit of reading. But the reality is, what you will see now is you will see wherever there is a hatch mark here, that's a point of criteria that you're looking for. Okay? And then throughout the questions, we've also stated, we've given an example, 6 of 7 criteria up here, 86% or this, this, this. And that's right in your protocol. That's built right in. So if you're just going through it, you got the safety policy in front of you. You say, I got to confirm that. There it is. There it is. There it is. There it is. I write a single note. I enter a single mark. This is something that is very, very important. That is your sample of how you came to your note, your justification for awarding 86%. So the other thing we really tried to do here, the other thing we tried to do with all our questions is to make sure that we weren't asking a question, we weren't asking a system question and asking about records in the same question, because that makes it very difficult for the auditor. If anybody wants to look at that quickly again there, just so we know that. So typically one question now instead of multiple questions within. So we want to get clearly, and it looks like a contradiction when I say, well, multiple questions within if you have multiple criteria, but that is different. There's one question being asked where there's criteria you have to prove out, not having an actual statement that says, could you measure A, and then 2 words later, could you measure Y, and you're going, well, do I measure A or do I measure Y? And then that's confusing when you read that, right? So we tried to be clear on that, and then evidence of implementation often scored and measured against the company's own declared standards. So if you say you're going to have, 4 site-specific hazard assessments a day, if you say that, then that's what we're going to ask you to measure against. If you don't like your policy, then change it. If you don't like your process, change it. If the process is too stringent or unrealistic, like your senior manager is going to visit the shop every 3 days, not realistic. Okay, maybe in a small company of 6, but in a company of 600, not going to work. Okay, so you need to make sure that we have that clear. Adjustments made to questions and/or scoring guidelines to ensure what was being asked was measurable and realistic. So objective evidence-based scoring made possible, including suggestions on how to do it. So we looked at this from three points of view. Andy and I and Justin looked at the question. And I looked at it from the perspective of an auditor's point of view, because I'm the person that's out there doing the workshops. I've worked with multiple audit tools, and I said, if I can't think this up in my mind in some imaginary scenario, chances are no one else is going to be able to do it because they're going to be out there on their own doing this. So I looked at it from that perspective. So everything I said, is this auditable? Can it actually be auditable? Justin looked at it from a teaching standpoint and said, yeah, what are we writing up there? Because we're going to have to teach new auditors this, and they're going to have to be able to read this once and apply it. And if they can't read it once and apply it, there's a problem, because they have to be able to interpret this. And Andy looked at it from the overall as a non-auditor and as a person who is a university professor to go and say, does this all fit? Is this proper use of the English language in this area, in this term? Is this basic terminology that any of us can look at and interpret, that we're not going to become confused in reading the statement? And he was the person that was looking at all the government standards and saying, no, we're missing the point on this government standard, or no, that was a misinterpretation, or this and this, and that's the way we looked at it. And so we had constant arguments for 3 days straight, or 3 days, 3 weeks. Surprised we're still talking to each other, but we were going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and we were looking at it from the health and safety perspective. Does this match or model what a health and safety management system should have in place? How could they prove this in place? Where would they look for this, right? And then when we got through that process, we looked at it and said, now let's send it out to the committee and see what all those auditors come back with, and they'll tell us whether it was reasonable or not, and which they did. And a lot of people had lots of good input. We didn't have to change very much into draft number 2, but what we did change was very important, because all the people that gave us information back was really good information. So preventative maintenance. Who has equipment? I know Denny does. Denny has trucks. Denny, do you do on your fuel haulers or your chemical haulers, do you guys do preventative maintenance? Yep. So can you tell me how I could prove out preventative maintenance?
Well, our policies state that our trucks are maintained as per the manufacturer's recommendation.
Okay, so that's a nice statement, Denny. I'm glad you got a great statement. So are you living the statement?
Yeah.
How would I do that? How would I prove it out?
I can show you all the service, and all the servicing of our trucks is done at Western Star, the dealership.
Okay.
So we don't do any in-house maintenance. Everything is done at the dealership.
Okay, so at the dealership, you could show me the results of Unit 27?
Yeah, I can go and get the computer report of
right on.
27 for the tank.
So what about if I don't trust those reports? How can I actually prove out what you say you're going to do on that tanker truck is actually done? What could I physically observe?
Well, you do go into the tank itself has the stamp by Transport Canada that the date that it was done on the truck.
Okay. So what about if it was your regular CVIP work that was done, and maybe you got a buddy that's working at Western Star. You're buying him a case of beer, you're taking him out for burgers, and he's doing your CVIPs on paper. How would I actually know for instance, the brakes on the truck were actually maintained as required every 10,000 hours, etc.?
That you would have to go to Western Star to get that information from their system.
So do you see the conversation we're having here? Denny keeps taking me back to paperwork over and over and over. And I keep asking for how would I visually do this? And the problem is I can't, because it's preventative maintenance. Unless I have a sensor at the end of my finger that I can stick in your transmission fluid and take it out and go, okay, that's about 300 hours. Or I put in the oil and I say, okay, yeah, that's about 6,000 kilometers. Or no, they only went 1,000 kilometers. Then I could say that these hidden things in preventative maintenance that most of us auditors will never be able to observe in that capacity.
Well,
okay?
In our case, you could also look at the document that I gave you, and you could go and get the GPS locator to show that on that day.
Okay. So having said that, is there an effective preventative maintenance program in place for equipment that satisfies legislative compliance? So we're asking about system, but then over here we're talking about schedules and records, and we got away from that. Okay, we don't want to get into that. And how would you prove this out? 80%? How would we prove this out? Documentation points? This is not easy to prove out. So we drew all kinds of funny designs on the board to try to come up with an idea how we'd prove this out, and we didn't do a very good job of it. So for us to ask this question, really, yes, we could interview him, and it would be a valuable interview, but we already know the schedules in front of us. We could prove an awful lot out on a piece of paper. So what we really want to look at here is we want to have defensible auditing. So C5A, is there a preventative maintenance program that includes, and this is now more realistic, is there a preventative maintenance program that is in place that includes, so there's your criteria again. You got 3 measurement points of criteria. An inventory or record of assets. How many of you have an inventory or record of assets at your company for your equipment? I'm sure if your hands were up, I would see lots. Okay, so you know the company that you know what you have is in compliance with legislated preventative maintenance requirement. We also would look at it and say is in compliance with the manufacturer's preventative maintenance, and that's very important because there's some that has nothing to do with legislation requirements, but the manufacturer says you must do this, this, and this in order to maintain the integrity of that piece of equipment. Now we go to the next question, which is a separate question. Is the preventative maintenance program being implemented as outlined? So I looked at what you've outlined, and now I have to look and see, and I have to review a sample. I want you guys to take that and tattoo it on the inside of your arm if you're an auditor. A sample of preventative maintenance documents. Okay? And we've used sample throughout the audit because that's a term we're not clear on in the English language. When you say you've audited Champion and you say you looked at all maintenance records for all trucks, that tells me that you went out and looked at 100,000 records. Okay? That's what that tells me. If you say all trucks, that means all 340 pieces of equipment. And that is absolutely impossible unless you were employed under Denny. And that's your job to go do that. And then you're not an auditor. Okay? So we have to use that word sample to qualify how we're coming to our conclusions in our defensible notes and justifying our sample. Okay, so maintenance program, schedule, and requirements. Enter the percentage of positive indicators. So in this case, we're picking, if Denny has 5 different types of trucks, let's say, and I go, okay, Denny, do they operate all year round? And this is where I'm coming up with my sampling strategy. And whatever my sampling strategy is, whatever the percent positive indicators are in relation to the company policies, now I do my cross-referencing and say, yes, you are 86% compliant, you're 100% compliant, you're 50% compliant, whatever the case may be. Now we get into We get into C5C. Has all equipment requiring preventative maintenance been included within the preventative maintenance program? So rather than the other one was to go out and observe the preventative maintenance program, we knew that was not observable. When we tore that question apart, we were saying, you know what, unless I'm a heavy-duty mechanic and I can go say, pull the wheels off that truck, Denny, I want to look at Unit 27 to see if you did this and this and this. I want to see if you greased this from one end to the other. It's not going to happen. And that's not what a management system audit is. We're not doing technical processes of work. So what we're looking at here is we want to say it's more important to draw a sample of equipment from the preventative maintenance program that may be observed at visited worksite. Observe equipment in the workplace to determine consistency with the inventory. So in other words, do you know what equipment you have, and do you have a maintenance schedule for it if required? And if you're releasing that out to site, documented equipment would be a positive indicator, while any non-documented equipment requiring preventative maintenance would be regarded as a negative indicator out on site. So if there's equipment out there that shows up and you go, that track hoe, I didn't see that in your list. Oh yeah, we bought it last week at Ritchie Brothers and we just put her into operation. Got the hazard assessments all completed for it. What about your maintenance records? Well, we didn't put it on the inventory, but we do have a maintenance schedule for it, and we ran it through that. And if that was the case, we even wrote in here, if a formal inventory has not been created, preventative maintenance records may be used to confirm the inclusion of equipment in the preventative maintenance program. So now myself as the auditor, I go and I see that track hoe. I didn't see it on the inventory initially when I looked at it. Maybe my memory's bad. I didn't catch it. So I write it down. I don't think that's on your inventory. And the safety guy goes, I don't think it is either. But I can tell you, we got maintenance, preventative maintenance schedule. It's in place. We've had it a month. We did a full check soon as we bought the piece of equipment and went through this, and this is what's set up to do. Just one sec, Lorraine, if I could. And then as soon as you do that, when you go back in, you go, okay, I need to check to see if, just have a look at those records to make sure. No problem, I'll prove that out for you. Now it becomes a positive indicator. Okay? Remember, in auditing, it's opportunities for the company to prove that they're following their own health and safety program. That's what it is. The word opportunities should stick in your mind. So how many opportunities did you have to prove that you're doing this? It's either going to be positive indicators or negative indicators. And so, are all investigations started immediately? So this is a word, like immediately, like to me, immediately like is, I fall down, somebody get me some paper before I can collect my thoughts and I got to start writing, right away. But in reality, is that how it happens in the workplace? And so what we have to do here is we have to allow the auditor to make judgment calls based on the criticality of starting that immediately. So we've written some guidelines around that. Are all investigations started within a prompt, reasonably practicable timeline appropriate to the nature of the investigation? Let's go back to the equipment. The guy backs into something on a site and tears off a hydraulic line. You pinch it off, you tie it off, you do whatever you got to do, you close a valve. However, that vehicle's out of service. Yes, you do need an investigation. Do you need to fly the guy up from Calgary to Cold Lake that day, shut down the job, and then start that investigation by the means of having a physical person on site? The fact that you took that out of process and you've identified it, that's really the start of the investigation. Whether you wrote it down on a piece of paper at 6 minutes after 2, or you wrote it down at 4 minutes after 12 that night, the reality is it's not the criticality of it at that point. You may choose to look at that vehicle and say, well, I'm not going to inspect that vehicle on site. Is everything else, did we damage anybody else's property? No, we didn't. We damaged our own. Okay, put it on a float truck and send it back to Red Deer, and we will deal with it when we get it to Red Deer. We will take our pictures, we will do our formal investigation. Our guy is based out of Red Deer, and I'm not sending him to Cold Lake. There's no value, okay? So when you look at that, so scoring guideline, review a sample of completed investigation records. Verify investigations were started promptly. The test of reasonably practicable should be applied to scenarios. For example, if evidence should be lost or a significant risk to workers allowed to continue, investigation should start immediately. So if you were on the highway and you have a crash on the side of the road and it's a snowy road, you want to start it immediately because they're going to come and put sand and ice and a bunch of emergency vehicles and they're going to mess with the scene. So you better get some pictures and you better start your investigation. if somebody's injured, that goes without saying. Remember, this does not exempt you from the law. The law of the land also dictates when those investigations are going to occur, but notice they don't tell you that it has to start like that. It's within reason or reasonably practicable, right? Timelines. So we have to bear those things in mind. So, for example, if evidence could be lost or significant risk to workers, that would happen right away. In other scenarios, logistics or circumstances may delay investigation from being immediate, okay? And that could be some companies do not do their own internal investigations once they're at a serious nature. Yeah. They contract a third party, and that third party may have to come from wherever in order to do that. And if it's not something that's compromising somebody's health or safety, or there's loss of production or something, then it may be a couple of days before that person can get to site to do it. And that is reasonable. So we want auditors to make that judgment call, and we're trusting that that will be used judiciously and appropriately, right, under the circumstances. Now, protocol questions related to investigations. F3F, scoring guidelines on all read, award no points if no investigations were completed. Now, for all the safety gurus in the room, I know that this is going to make you choke on your sandwich here. But we've looked at this from the perspective of not all environments will have a near miss or an incident every year. It is possible that 16 engineers working in downtown Calgary, doing their work on computer screens, creating documents, exchanging those documents back and forth, and going to site once in a while, and I'm talking once in a while, very rarely, to confirm that a vessel that they designed or the system that's in place is in place, and everybody gets their picture taken, and they go, yes, that the construction company did provide you with a fan this big and under these circumstances. Yes, that's what our drawings were approved to. May have an opportunity where they did not have a near miss. But please look at these words: exclusively low risk administrative work sites only. What we're talking about here, if you are sending multiple engineers out to sites and that's their work, chances are they're going to have as much opportunity on those leased roads to have a near miss as anybody else. They're out there interacting, once you leave this building and go out onto Deerfoot today, we can almost guarantee most of us will have a near miss before we get home. And if we were working and actually wanted to write it down, we would have our near miss for the year, okay? We would use our inspection. If you have some type of a health condition in your workplace where somebody is in, if there's something of that nature, there should be a report. There should be, if there's a WCB injury, if there's an ergonomic problem with somebody that's the receptionist, that her desk does not, or his desk does not work for him or her, then you very well could have a WCB claim going through. These things would require some type of an investigation, okay? So what we're talking about here is, again, the auditor has to defend their notes as vigorously for not using this as they would for using it. Okay, so either direction you go. If you're writing about an incident, you're going to have to write defensible notes. If you're applying this under very rare circumstances, then you would have to defend your notes as to why you did not use it, and basically say there was no other indicators through other reports or this or that where this circumstance would have shown up. There are safety people I know that are saying right now, this is absolutely wrong, and I understand that, and I feel your pain. But it is not a perfect world. There are different types of environments. So element B, realization we are all still in a phase where some companies are still en route to proper task-based formal hazard assessments. Okay, so some people have gotten bent out of shape with what we mean by formal hazard assessments. It is very simple. It is task-based hazard assessments. You need to know who works at your company, number one. You need to know the tasks those people do, number two, and you need to have a list of those tasks. Number three, you need to take those tasks, and for whether it's a task that has multiple steps, or if it's simply using a computer, you need to understand that there are potential health and safety hazards associated with doing those tasks, and you need to identify those. And once you identify those health and safety hazards, You then need to apply a risk ranking to those hazards. And from there, you need to look at the risk ranking and find out, and you need to be able to prioritize them in some order as to what is more or less risky, poses the most risk, okay? So there is potential is what we're talking about out there. That's really all formal task-based hazard assessment is about. It is not, they were never designed, Enform didn't think this up, nobody that thought it up last week. This has been practiced in industry, it has been practiced for years and years and years and years and years in the chemical industry, in the petrochemical industry. This is nothing new. It's the way we are viewing the term hazard assessment. So in the oil and gas industry, in the 3 years I've been here, I have heard every possible abbreviation known to man. JHA, JSA, HAA, TYD, blah, blah, blah. I can't even remember how many different. And then I say, well, what is a TAA? Oh, that's when we do this and this and this. Oh, okay, so that captures this and this. Oh, do you do it on one page? No, we have a 40-page document that we do that with. And you have to relate page 1 to page 13, and 13 relates to page 42. Oh, I didn't tell you, there's more than 40. And then we do this, and that has to do with the safe operating procedure. And once we have that, then you go in through this, and you go through this step and that step. And I go, oh, okay, so you've confused me enough. If I was sitting on site, I'm sure I could understand this. This would make sense. So all we're talking about, folks, whether you call it, whatever you call it, the auditor has to be able to go there and say, these are the people that work at the company. These are the tasks that these people do. These are the health and safety hazards related to those tasks. Somewhere you have a risk ranking, and somewhere you have a prioritization method. Color code, numbering system, whatever matrix you use, any of us as auditors will gladly accept that as long as we can understand it. That's the important thing. Oh, this one here. Frontline supervisors. When this audit protocol changed, it changed for the purpose of the oil and gas industry wanted their frontline supervisors measured. And more than somebody so much in an office. But what we had to do when we were going through this, well, what do you mean by a frontline supervisor? Because that could be a frontline supervisor at Walmart. But for the intent of this audit and what our industry wanted implemented into it, they wanted the focus on that oversee workers involved in field or shop or oversee dispatch workers. And we realized when we're going through these questions that this is a large portion of our community of workers. Service type jobs where people are not seeing their supervisor every day of the week, and they are dispatched, and truck drivers are dispatched, and they don't talk to their supervisor every day. They got their runs and their work, and they're communicating at various points when need to be. Okay, so expanded guidelines, as we said, we've written examples right in here, and this was direct indicator for some of the people that reviewed and said you should have scoring right in there. That takes the mystery out of it for people. It gives them a quick example. It's easy, and most of us are not doing math every day. So, but it just helps you to understand what you're doing and what you're required to capture in your notes. Okay, so this here, so Laurent asked that earlier, or somebody, and said, hey, are we going to be able to have these guidelines when you're actually looking at the interview questions? And because the interview questions have been reduced substantially, on average, your senior managers, you're probably going to ask them 22 questions. On average, a worker's probably going to be 40 questions. However, some of those questions, a worker will probably capture some of that information in one sentence. He may capture three answers within that. We think the questions flow better. We think now that when you actually interview somebody, you will be able to get the flow of the interview as to what you need to follow up on based on that interview, or if there's something that this person is bringing to you that is of real value. I think before, when you're trying to capture, and Wendy and I had this conversation, when you're trying to capture 100 points of information and you have 1 hour to do it, all you're doing is going check, 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 and by the time you catch that 100 points, you don't even know what the person said. You don't even know who you just interviewed, because I tried it. And so Wendy and I had a discussion, and I had to do an audit the next week, and I said, I'm going to go out and time myself, Wendy. And I interviewed a rig manager. and I was an hour and 10 minutes. And that was having a normal conversation, and I had to go and capture all of those points of information. And to be truthful with you, I didn't know what he said in the first 20 by the time I got to the last 20, right? So it was just so much information. And a lot of the information, it was so detailed when you were trying to capture it that the person on the receiving end of your question was always asking for clarification. Yeah. And if they're constantly asking for clarification, then it's not making sense to them. And then in some cases, they said, didn't you just ask me that question? Actually, I didn't. It has 3 parts to it, and I just asked you part 1. Now we go to part 2 and 3. So what we did here was to try to get a very clear question and have it as open-ended as possible with the expectation that you're going to have to, in many cases, have a framing question. So, are you involved with formal hazard assessment? I should know that before I interview you, but say I don't. I asked you that question, and if you say no, then I don't ask you about the development of formal hazard assessment because you've been here 3 months and you can't know that answer, and you weren't a part of it. However, if you were a part of it, then I say, oh, great. So, what kind of a team, or what do you do, or what, et cetera, and then we move through the appropriate questions. So then that allows the conversation to flow. It allows you to keep conversation with the person in front of you and capture the appropriate information. And so what you will see in your example, you will have an example question, and you can choose to use our phrasing or not, and that's fine, as long as you get the information that's required for the question. And so you will have that, and it will show you senior managers, middle managers, supervisor, workers, who it's asked for. And there's a number of these as well that you're going to have to do a kind of a secondary grouping to say, okay, how long have you worked for the company? I worked for the company this long. Should you know the answer to this question, or should you not? And if you could not know the answer to the question, then that should become a not ask, which does not affect it negatively or positively, okay? So that's the important thing, is really knowing the person that's in front of you and asking the appropriate questions. If you have an administrative office people, do not go through those series of PPE questions, and do not talk to them about site-specific hazard assessment, because they'll think there's something wrong with your mind. We will, if we have this here, there may also be indicates of only a subset should be asked. Only ask those involved in the development of formal hazard assessments. So we understand that if you're a company of 200 or 300 or 400 people or 50 people, you are not going to have every person involved in the hazard assessment process that I described, okay? That's not realistic. It's not realistic, and it's not productive. You're trying to get from A to B in developing these hazard assessments with people that are affected by the work. People that are experienced, I want to have involved in that, right? I want to get my experienced people involved in that. I want to get my committees involved in that, et cetera. But I may have 40 workers and only have 4 workers involved in formulating those, or assessing them, or reassessing them after an incident even, potential. Okay? We do provide a sample question in that case, and we will provide those to you. And by the way, we're also reformatting all the tools. Aaron's been working on it for a few days now, and we will be releasing those tools. I'm hoping we'll get them on the website next week sometime, if everything goes as planned. And that will be where, if you want to collect some of this information on a Word document out on the site, because you can't take a computer out on site, et cetera, then you'll be able to capture those and work with those tools. And it will provide you those questions. And I just don't, myself interviewing, I really have difficulty with the computer trying to capture interviews. So I like doing it on a tally sheet and then entering my information later. I can just do it a lot quicker, right? So we're going to have those set up for you as well. Okay, thank you folks for coming. I appreciate it.